Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all having a fantastic day. Before we begin, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. For most of America, Rob Reiner has always been easy to define. He was Matehead, a loud, lovable foil on All of the Family. He was the director behind some of Hollywood's most enduring films, When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, Stand By Me, A Few Good Men. He was the son of comedy legend Carl Reiner, born into laughter, scripts, and studio lights. But for more than 3 decades, that familiar image told only half the story. Behind the confident smile, behind the director's chair, and far away from red carpets and applause, Rob Reiner was living a second life, one shaped not by fame, but by doubt, responsibility, quiet fear, and an internal battle few ever saw. And only now, as time has softened the need for masks, is the full picture coming into focus. The public Rob Reiner. From the outside, Reiner's life looked charmed. He transitioned effortlessly from acting to directing, something few performers managed successfully. His films didn't just succeed, they became cultural landmarks. Lines from his movies entered everyday language. Scenes were replayed, quoted, and loved across generations. Hollywood saw him as reliable, smart, principled. Audiences saw him as confident and assured. He appeared to know exactly who he was. But that certainty was carefully constructed. The weight of a legendary name. Being Carl Reiner's son came with privileges, but also enormous pressure. Carl Reiner wasn't just famous, he was revered, a comedy pioneer, a creative force who seemed endlessly confident and productive. To the public, Rob appeared to inherit that brilliance naturally. Privately, he questioned whether any of his success truly belonged to him. For years, Rob Reiner wrestled with a silent fear. What if I'm only here because of my name? What if the applause stops when people stop seeing my father in me? That fear never left him, not during his biggest successes, not even when his films became classics. Instead, it followed him quietly, shaping choices no one else noticed. The director who never felt finished, Reiner's first life was public, visible, celebrated. His second life existed in the spaces between projects, late nights alone with scripts, rewatching his own films not with pride, but with relentless self-criticism. While audiences laughed and cried, he obsessed over what didn't work. He was never satisfied, never fully at peace with success. Every film felt like a test he could still fail. Friends recall that even at the height of his career, Reiner spoke less about accolades and more about what he could have done better. He carried success like a fragile object, afraid it might shatter at any moment. That constant pressure to live up to his past, his father, and his own expectations created a private world of anxiety hidden behind professional confidence. The activist behind the camera. Then there was another layer, one the public barely noticed at first. While Hollywood celebrated his romantic comedies and adventure films, Reiner was becoming deeply engaged in political and social issues. He read obsessively. He attended meetings quietly. He questioned systems. He worried about the future. This wasn't performative activism. It was personal. For decades, he felt torn between his role as entertainer and his growing sense of responsibility as a citizen. Speaking out risked alienating audiences. Staying silent felt dishonest. So he lived both lives at once. One Rob Reiner made films that brought joy. The other lay awake at night, wondering whether joy was enough. Family man in the shadows. At home, Reiner's second life took on an entirely different shape. Away from cameras, he was not a Hollywood figure. He was a husband and father, deeply protective and fiercely present. He guarded his family's privacy with intensity, refusing to let fame dictate their lives. Many who knew him personally describe a man far quieter than his public image. Thoughtful, sometimes withdrawn, emotionally observant. While the world saw confidence, his family saw reflection, concern, vulnerability. He worried about being absent, about repeating mistakes, about whether success justified the time it stole. These weren't conversations he shared publicly. They didn't fit the narrative of Hollywood triumph, so they stayed hidden. The years of decline and silence. As Hollywood changed, so did Reiner's career. The industry grew louder, faster, less patient. The kinds of films he loved were no longer guaranteed studio backing. Some of his later projects failed to connect with audiences. Public perception shifted quietly. Where once he was untouchable, now he was questioned. Some wondered if he'd lost his touch. What no one saw was how deeply those years affected him. For someone whose identity was intertwined with storytelling, rejection wasn't just professional, it was personal. And instead of retreating publicly, he turned inward. That inward turn marked the deepest period of his double life, the private reckoning. In the years that followed, Rob Reiner began re-examining everything: his work, his beliefs, his fears, his definition of success. He spoke less, listened more. He accepted that acclaim was temporary, and that chasing it endlessly had cost him peace. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he'd hidden for decades. He had spent years trying to prove he deserved his place, instead of trusting that he already had it. That realization didn't come with fanfare. It came quietly, slowly, honestly. Why we're only hearing this now? Rob Reiner never staged a dramatic reveal. There was no confessional interview or explosive memoir. The truth emerged gradually in interviews where his tone softened, in reflections that carried humility rather than bravado, in moments where he spoke not as a legend, but as a man who had lived, learned, and endured. Only now, with decades behind him, does the full picture make sense. The double life wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about deception. It was about survival. The man behind the legacy, Rob Reiner's story, is not one of hidden darkness, but of quiet complexity. For 30 years, the world saw the filmmaker. Few saw the man carrying expectations, fear, responsibility, and self-doubt all at once. And perhaps that's why his films endure, because the man who made them understood contradiction. He understood love and fear, hope and disappointment, joy and vulnerability. In the end, Rob Reiner didn't hide a double life from the world. He lived it to that one day he could finally live as one whole person. And only now, when the need to prove anything has faded, are we beginning to truly see him. The quiet freedom of being understood. In recent years, those close to Rob Reiner have noticed something different, not in his opinions or his work ethic, but in his posture toward life itself. The tension that once lived in his shoulders seems lighter. The urgency that once drove him to measure every project against legacy has softened into something closer to acceptance. For the first time in decades, he no longer feels compelled to outrun his past. Reiner has spoken openly about how age reframes ambition. The hunger for validation that once fueled him has given way to a deeper desire, clarity. He no longer needs every film to be a statement or every moment to justify his place in history. That shift alone closed the final chapter of his double life. What replaced it wasn't silence, but honesty. Reconciling with the son he once was. One of the most personal reckonings came when Reiner reflected on his relationship with his father. For years, Carl Reiner's shadow loomed large, not because Carl demanded it, but because Rob imposed it on himself. Success felt like borrowed time. Praise felt conditional. Even love sometimes felt earned rather than given. Only later did Rob recognize the irony. The very pressure he felt was born from admiration, not judgment. In accepting that truth, he let go of a burden he'd carried far too long. He stopped trying to be as great and allowed himself to simply be himself. That internal reconciliation did more for his peace than any award ever could. Legacy beyond film. Today, Rob Reiner's legacy extends far beyond box office numbers or iconic scenes. It lives in the filmmakers he inspired, those who learned that heart and intelligence could coexist on screen. It lives in audiences who grew up believing in friendship because of Stand By Me, in love because of When Harry Met Sally, and in courage because of A Few Good Men. But perhaps most importantly, his legacy lives in his example, that it's possible to evolve without erasing who you were. For 30 years, he balanced success with uncertainty, public confidence with private doubt, and instead of breaking him, that tension refined him. The final truth about the double life. In the end, the phrase double life doesn't mean what people expect. Rob Reiner wasn't hiding secrets. He wasn't deceiving the world. He wasn't living two opposing identities. He was living a human one. One part of him belonged to the audience, the other belonged to his conscience. And for a long time, he didn't know how to merge them. Now he does. And in that merging, there is no shock, only understanding. Because the most surprising truth of all is this: Rob Reiner's greatest role was never on screen or behind the camera. It was learning how to stop performing and finally live as himself, a different kind of success. What followed wasn't a dramatic retreat or a grand reinvention. It was something far quieter and far rarer in Hollywood: contentment without applause. Rob Reiner began choosing his moments more carefully. He no longer felt the need to chase relevance or compete with a younger generation. Instead, he leaned into mentorship, conversation, and reflection. When he spoke, it wasn't to dominate the room, but to add perspective shaped by decades of trial and error. Those who encountered him during this period noticed a striking change. He listened more than he spoke. He laughed more easily. He seemed less burdened by how he was perceived. It was as if the man who once lived divided between expectation and belief had finally allowed those two worlds to overlap. The stories he never told until now. In private conversations, Reiner began sharing things he'd never articulated before: the fear of being dismissed, the exhaustion of always being the successful one, the loneliness that can exist even at the center of attention. He spoke about how praise can become a trap, how being loved for your achievements makes you afraid of still being loved when you fail. For years, that fear had driven him to keep moving, keep proving, keep building. Only later did he realize that the people who mattered most never required proof at all. That realization didn't erase the past, but it softened it. Regrets became lessons. Missed opportunities became part of a larger arc rather than permanent scars. Fame without illusion. One of the quiet truths Reiner came to accept was this: fame amplifies who you already are. It doesn't complete you. In his early years, success felt like an answer. Later, it felt like a question, and eventually, it became simply a fact. Neither a cure nor a curse, but something to be handled responsibly. He stopped confusing visibility with value. That shift allowed him to engage with the world more honestly. When he spoke about ideas, it wasn't to persuade everyone. It was to be transparent about where he stood. Agreement became less important than integrity. In that sense, his later years were not louder, but clearer. The man his films prepared him to be. Looking back, it's hard not to see how his films foreshadowed this ending. Stand By Me was about the moment you realize childhood doesn't last forever. When Harry Met Sally was about time, patience, and emotional honesty. A Few Good Men was about truth, what it costs, and why it matters anyway. Perhaps Rob Reiner was always telling himself these stories before he was ready to live them. Perhaps the double life wasn't a contradiction at all, but a process. The final integration. Today, Rob Reiner exists as a fully integrated version of himself: artist, citizen, father, son, and man. There is no longer a need to separate the public from the private, the filmmaker from the thinker. What once felt like opposing forces now feel like chapters of the same book. And that may be the most meaningful ending of all. Because in a world obsessed with reinvention, Rob Reiner offers something far more profound: the courage to stay, to reflect, and to become whole. Slowly, imperfectly, and honestly. The double life didn't end with a revelation. It ended with peace.